Okay, good morning. This is our machine learning final presentation. And my name is Marcus. And also on the Zoom call are Ben Lamarck and Nishal. Sorry, Nishal, I don't know how to say your last name.
It's okay. It's too difficult. The host can help you with.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to get us started off today and tell us about what we did for our project and then also about the data. And then Ben is going to tell us how and kind of more about in depth in our model. And then Nishal is going to finish us up and tell us about improvements to our model and wrap up our presentation. So I'll get started. So our project was a sports attendance predictor. And um, so basically, we wanted to predict NFL game attendance. And we started with NFL because we live in America and that's like the #1 sport, I think. And hopefully we might be able to abstract this model eventually and take it out to maybe predict any sports league. So we used data from past seasons to create our model. And we did this to answer a simple question: how many people will attend the games? And let's talk about why. So obviously we want to know which teams have high attendance, which teams have low attendance, and maybe knowing which ones have low attendance is more important. Um, so city planning is very important. You can see to the left here, that's a picture of kind of like a parade Denver had for the Broncos when they were going to the Super Bowl. So things like traffic and just city planning is super important. So if we can predict how many people are going to go to the games, that would help out the city a lot. Not only, but also if you're the manager like of a stadium and you need to hire people to sell the food and clean up afterwards and that type of thing, this could be a very important way to save money. And then, of course, sports is a game, so there are super fans and people who just want to know this stuff for fun. And finally, there are aftermarket ticket sellers, so like scalpers. Like, if there's not many people going to the game, you're probably not going to sell those aftermarket tickets. So how did we do this? So basically, there's two subsets of our data. So the first type, and I probably we'll find out, but performance. So for example, how many Pro Bowlers on the team? What's their winning percentage? There's that type of performance data. And then there's also kind of like location data. So for example, what's the city? What's the state? What's the weather? Does a cold climate have good or bad attendance? Um, so all of this data came from various websites. Um, of course, all of it sourced back to NFL, but there was a couple layers, but we did web scraping and unfortunately some copying and pasting and some metric generation. So that was definitely one of the harder parts, was getting the data, because I mean there's just so many kind of human things that happened with the data over time, and so we had to work hard to filter that out. For example, some teams have moved locations, and so that's been really difficult to track and consider that type of thing. So here's kind of a list of all of our variables. So for example, you can see there's win percentage, um, their division, if they went to the playoffs, the capacity, that type of thing. For the climate, we use the Köppen climate classification, which is like an academic meteorology classification of the climate. So for example, it'll be like sub-Mediterranean desert would be an example of that. Um, and then there was some data that we included and later excluded just because it had kind of and it not a bad effect, but it made the model too dependent on the previous year's data. So here's a big part of what we did for our EDA. So here, this graph, we can see the average attendance percentage. So the darker the color, the higher percentage they have. So you can see like Texas loves their football. This state does too. You know, Colorado likes football. You know, we show up to the games. So that's what that shows. And then over here, we have the graphs that kind of show, so this one is climate classification. So this orange color here, all these states have the same climate classification. California is its own color. So is Washington. And then here is median Pro Bowler count. So this is kind of like if you took the median amount of Pro Bowlers each team has had every year, this is what that would look like. So we kind of did this just graph layout to see if there was any obvious effects like, oh, you know, the orange states tend to have a higher attendance percentage, but it wasn't as clear cut as just looking at that. And that's why we have machine learning. So basically we did linear regression, and I'll hand off to Ben now to talk more about that.
Yeah, basically once we had all our data in one place, first what we did was standardize the data by scaling it to express how many standard deviations above or below average each value was. After that, we did a linear regression on the data, and as part of that linear regression, we did a five-fold cross-validation. That's where you'll do 5 linear regressions that are all done with the 80-20 split. That way, each row of data gets a prediction, or gets a turn to be part of the testing set. And then after that, we were able to calculate the difference between what they were predicted for and what their actual attendance was. And you can actually go to slide 9 because that is the next one. This is some results. The first graphic, that is a weight of the average linear regression variables. As you see, capacity is a pretty big part of it. You know, how many seats you have that we can put into the stadium, but other variables were important as well. The climate was actually the second most important, followed by win percentage, but then also whether you made the playoffs and how far you went was important, as well as, you know, the Pro Bowler count, which is kind of our attempt to measure the number of stars on a team. The root mean square error was 5,000 members of attendance per game, which it kind of sounds like a lot, the raw number, but that only makes up 7% of actual attendance, and it had a 77.5 correlation with the data, so it turned out to be a relatively good prediction, especially considering we took out one of the easiest variables for predicting it, which was previous attendance. And then we can go to slide 10.
And am I on the right slide?
I'm sorry?
Am I on the right slide?
Okay, so I was actually looking back at the actual one that wasn't on Zoom. Sorry about that. And then here's some more results for the first graphic here. That's just a scatter plot plotting actual versus predicted attendance. Each color is a different team. They're not color coded for their actual colors or anything, but it kind of helps show the variety. The team in the team with the kind of goldish colored dots in the top right corner, those are a bunch of Cowboy seasons. For instance, they turned out the best in terms of actual attendance and difference between actual and predicted attendance. And then the second graphic there, that's just taking, for all of our data starting from 2006, you know, how well each team performed. But then what we also wanted to look at was more recent data, which we've assumed would probably be more important for making decisions now. That'll be on slide, and that's on this slide here. so from 2000, and I guess at this point I should explain that. So say if we're looking at 2018's numbers, that means we're looking at 2018's results, and then using that to predict 2019's attendance. So we're kind of starting a year before and then going into the future. And so if you look at that, the Green Bay Packers actually did the best in terms of actual attendance minus predicted attendance. But actually, Denver, the Broncos are pretty high up there as well. And I guess the point of this graphic is to kind of show not so much who did so much better than usual, but who did worse than expected, and are those possibly teams that should consider moving to a different city, or at least kind of changing how they do things and seeing if maybe they can do something different to attract more fans to the park. If you look at the bottom teams, which are on the right-hand side, the Cincinnati Bengals, they've done the worst in terms of actual attendance minus predicted attendance. So maybe that's a team that should consider moving to a different city. You see, some of the teams actually already have moved. The Raiders are in the bottom third, and they moved to Las Vegas recently. And the Rams are in the bottom. The Rams are in the bottom three, and they already moved. I thought that was a pretty interesting situation and something that we should take a closer look at to see what's going on there.
Right. Like one metric I'd be interested to see that I just thought of is like, so you said Rams moved to LA, which California already, I don't know when they moved, but they've had a couple teams in their state. I'd be interested to add like a metric called like how many teams per state and see if that has any correlation.
Yeah, that is a good idea, actually, especially because if you notice, a lot of the California teams didn't perform very well. Not only the LA Rams, but the this SDG acronym on there. That's for the Chargers. They were originally in San Diego and then also moved to LA. So then you also have the fact that two teams from LA were even in the same city. So
Right.
that might have played a role as well in terms of suppressing attendance. And then the second graphic, that's another important thing about the second one is that I guess you don't want to only think about who's drawing less than what's predicted. It's also important to look at pure attendance numbers as well. So if you can identify teams that draw a lot less than predicted and have low actual attendance numbers, those would really be the teams that we should be looking at. In the second graphic, you see the lowest drawing team was the Chargers, and they have moved. So it makes you wonder if perhaps NFL was using similar numbers to us and trying to identify teams that ought to be moving. If you notice the Rams were fairly high in attendance, at least since 2014. So they did have decently high raw numbers. It's just that they also had a run of fairly good teams during that time and should have been drawing more players. On the next slide, we'll be able to look at a breakdown by season of how the Rams were doing. And you notice 2015 was the last year the Rams played in St. Louis. They actually had a good spike of attendance their first year playing in the new stadium. That would count as 2015 because we're using the 2015 year's stats to predict 2016 attendance numbers, which was the first year they were in Los Angeles. And you notice they did have a spike when they first moved, but then they kind of leveled out. And if you look at the green line shows what they were predicted they should have been at, and that was always a little lower than what it should have been while they were in St. Louis. But then after after they moved, that went up and their team got better, but they still didn't draw all that many more fans. So that's something that, maybe that's because there's another team in LA. Maybe, maybe it's because the people in LA still had um, ties to other teams and weren't as excited to go to the stadium to see the Rams play. And the Rams actually historically, before they were in St. Louis, they were in LA before that as well. So they would still have, they would still have probably some leftover fans that like can remember when the Rams were in LA the first time. Um, but either way, they're not doing too great at draw. They are drawing more fans in than when they were in St. Louis, but still not as much as they should be. So it makes you wonder uh, if the NFL is happy with that, or if they're just happy they're drawing more people or not. And then the second graphic on the side, this is just on the right. That's a comparison of what they were in St. Louis and then what they were in LA. I mean, I'm actually from St. Louis, and the Rams were kind of made fun of a lot while they were in St. Louis. They were good briefly in the late '90s and early 2000s. They had, they went to a couple Super Bowls during that time frame. But during the years that we have our data from 2006 to 2015 when they left, they were a pretty poor performing team. They were a standard deviation below average in terms of having pro bowlers, a standard deviation below average win percentage. Division is set up so that the bigger positive number, the worse it is. So they're almost a standard deviation worse than in terms of winning the division. They also had a smaller stadium than usual. Almost a whole standard deviation below in terms of capacity. And as you see at the bottom, on average they drew 3,000 less fans per game than what was predicted, and that can add up to a lot of money over the years. But after they moved to LA, their team pretty much immediately started getting better. I don't know enough to say if that was just good timing for them, but they were above average in terms of Pro Bowlers, in terms of team performance, in terms of their stadium. Their stadium is huge compared to average, but still they didn't draw as many people in it. In fact, they increased the difference between how much they should have been filling the stadium and how much they were, losing out on over 8,000 guests per game, which is a pretty serious amount of revenue over the course of the games.
Okay, cool.
And I'll hand this off to Nishal, and he'll talk about ways that we can improve the model.
Yeah.
So these are this is one of the improvements / another feature that we'd like to add is just like a simple user-enabled program. So it would consist of the user entering in values for each of the values that we used to calculate our predicted attendance. And so the user could enter something crazy, and we could get a weird attendance number. So basically, how we would do that is we would use the same way. Basically, it would just be through Python and getting user data for each of the values, and then putting that into a series, and then appending that to the data frame. And then for the attendance, we'd probably just take an average of the previous year's attendance and add it to that year. Or we could actually have the user enter that year's attendance as well if they wanted to, and then predict the next year's attendance. And then there's obviously a lot of other things we want to do to improve the model, like just make it a bit more complex, maybe use a bit more models to make the prediction more accurate. But yeah, that's most of the improvements. And in conclusion, like, it was a really fun project to work on. It really helped that we were all able to work on a project that we enjoyed and had an interest in. We were all able to add our own spin, like Marcus did with the weather. Like, that wasn't originally going to be part of the plan, but Marcus came up with a great idea, and we were able to add that in. And like Pro Bowler count, and just not just attendance alone, but a lot of other different factors that can influence attendance. And we really want to work on this in the future because there's a lot of ways we can go about improving the model, and adding more data, more variables, even probably to influence the attendance prediction. More as we went on, the project actually became more about predicting the attendance and seeing which factors really influenced it. So we'd love to add like more variables and just see what factors have a really big impact on attendance. Um, and other than that, in one of our, as you guys probably saw in the data, the attendance predicted could actually be higher than the capacity. It could be like 102 or 104%. And of course, that's unrealistic technically because you can't actually have more than 100% attendance. But, there's a lot of applications to this. A lot of different people can use our data, like managers from the team, people who deal with the attendance, trying to make more revenue. They could use that prediction to plan out how they want to do, they could go about it in many different ways. They could hire more workers to plan for that. They could acquire more seats in the stadium. Uh, there's just a lot of different things they could do. But yeah, that is
Yeah.
also another thing actually is that they could do is raise the ticket prices even, generate more revenue since they realize they have a demand for their stadium and attendance. So yeah, a lot of different people can use our data to help them. But yeah,
All
that
right.
is.
Cool. Thank you guys, and I think that ends our presentation. Is there anything else anyone wants to add? No? Okay,
Yes.
that wraps. All right. Thanks, guys, and thank you, Ashish, for a great semester. Hope you're doing well. Bye.